things that you've seen in previous years with a little bit new mixed in. One of the things I do is I don't only just talk about individual species in a given session, but I do try to include some ecological and scientific information. So that way we can just all kind of be on the same page when it comes to understanding invasive species, how they affect us, and what we can do about them. So let's just go ahead and jump in here. We're talking this evening about the Asian bush honeysuckle, and it's a pretty good time to be talking about it. Anything that was green along the understory of any woods that you went through in the last week or two, it was all Asian bush honeysuckle. Some of it may have been multiflora rose, but I'm very confident that it was mostly honeysuckle. I have a couple of bushes of this beginning to develop yet again in my yard this year, so I'm probably going to spend a lot of time pulling them out. And I'm guessing a lot of you have similar experiences because you wouldn't be here otherwise. Unfortunately, while this plant is pretty, it's also incredibly competitive, it's invasive, it does destroy opportunities for our native plants, and in general, we want to eradicate it as much as possible. So we're going to talk a little bit about this plant. Now, there are several different invasive bush honeysuckle species here. The one that we think of the most, the Asian bush honeysuckle, is the one that probably is one of the worst offenders in this sense. Unfortunately, it's here due to us. We originally brought it here because, like I said, it's pretty. We thought it would make an excellent ornamental shrub. It does, and unfortunately, it's the gift that keeps on giving. They are extremely prolific, and they are very good at competing in new environments. So this is why we now have this infestation of them across our state. Unfortunately, too, for those people who aren't used to any invasive honeysuckles, there are lots of plants that can be confused for them, or vice versa. I've actually had people call me thinking that a plant was a bush honeysuckle, and when I looked at it, it was in fact a lilac. So there is a lot of misinformation when it comes to this particular plant. Now, what I want to do first is I want to get us all on the same page when we talk about invasive species. This can be kind of tough because a lot of these invasive species also tend to be plants that we like or we see a lot of. For example, the Callery or Bradford pear that you see on the screen in front of you. It's a popular ornamental tree to plant, but unfortunately it spreads very, very easily, making it invasive. So why don't we go ahead and define invasive species? That one people usually give a very simple answer to, but there are some important factors to consider there. An invasive species is a plant or animal that is present in an environment that is outside of its native range. Now, that definition right there makes it sound like anything could be invasive. European honeybees could be invasive if you wanted to make that argument. But there's another factor to consider. With an invasive species, no herbivores or predators will readily identify them as a prey item, or at least not very easily. So that means that there is no natural biocontrol. There are no natural enemies. There's nothing in the environment to slow their spread and development. And then the third thing that's included with that is that they outcompete native species. When you have this combination of things, you have an invader, you have an invasive species. So if you want an example, let's talk about multiflora rose for just a moment. We're going to talk about this more in a later session too. If you go out to McCormick's Creek right now, you will find tons of multiflora rose throughout their woods because it has invaded that area and is out competing local species to cover the forest understory there. And the park staff have been working very, very hard for a few years now to eradicate it. That's an example of an invasive species. All of the honeysuckle that you could see growing along roadsides and woodlots near people's homes are invasive species. I'm stressing this distinction here because there are lots of ornamentals or other organisms that we have that aren't native to this environment, but they may be introduced. They may not outcompete locals. They may not have any negative impacts on local ecosystems. They just aren't native. It's important to make that distinction because not everything needs to be eradicated out of our environment. So another factor that goes with being an invasive species is that they are almost always introduced through human activity. I would say that they are always introduced through human activity, typically through shipping or intentional movement. So for example, the emerald ash borer that has essentially extirpated ash trees out of Indiana, That insect was brought here accidentally because it was hiding in wood pallets that were used for shipping materials between here and its native range. A lot of the plants, including the honeysuckle we're going to go over this evening, were introduced as potential ornamentals or potential crop plants. Now, one of the things that an invasive species is very good at is that they typically reduce local biodiversity. Now, that is a very fancy way of saying that the number of different and unique species in an area. Some of you may look at it and be like, well, I'm not sure what that really means in the overall scope of things. Well, the more unique species you have within a given ecosystem, the stronger that ecosystem becomes because it has more than one way to answer big changes. So let's say a fire burns through a forest, but that forest isn't linked to a fire ecology. All the trees burn, but they don't, and nothing germinates after that. Well, if you have lots of different unique species, you'll have species that may germinate after a fire event. Or if, say, there's a sudden massive event like a flood that goes through, you have different survivors who have different survival strategies, all based on the fact that there are just different unique species present. The other thing that an invader will do is that they will endanger things that we as humans need. They can endanger important crops. You can find invasive species invading the fields in which we're growing our food. They can easily damage landscape, causing erosion and other issues, and they can simply devalue our land. If you see a mass of multiflora rose growing through a beautiful set of woods, making it impassable without getting stuck on thorns, nobody's going to want to buy that piece of land. These are all things that this is going to have an effect on us as human beings. So let's talk about the concept of competition too. So I said earlier that invasive species will outcompete native species. Well, there are a few examples of this, some better than others, about how different animals or plants will do this. And right now I'm showing you one of those examples, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. This one is an interesting gray area kind of story. We introduced the Asian lady beetle into our country intentionally because what was going on back in the 60s, some of our nut industry was being attacked by aphids and other insects. And that industry was going to collapse. Essentially, our nut industry was going to be gone. We would not have almonds or pecans or anything. A lot of ecologists and entomologists got together and figured out that this insect would make an excellent biocontrol for it. And they decided to go ahead and release them to see if it'd work. And it worked like a charm. It worked very, very well. In fact, we're still deriving a benefit today out of multicolored Asian lady beetle because they consume aphids in our gardens and on our trees and everywhere else. The trouble is that they're too good at their job and they've essentially outcompeted native species. Think about the last time you saw a red or a pink lady beetle. I'm guessing you've only seen one or two in recent years. And that's a pretty common story you hear now. So that's kind of a gray area where we're still deriving a benefit, but let's go a little further. Let's use kudzu as an example. Kudzu is thought to be a great food option, and someone brought it over and planted it. And folks, what you are looking at right now is kudzu spreading over a forest, taking it over completely. I used to live in Mississippi where this invasive species was very common, and I cannot possibly express to you enough how much this stuff will just advance over everything and cover it all. We're talking telephone poles, wires between them, trees, any other plant in their way, houses, kudzu will grow right over it. That is a great example of an invader outcompeting the natives to a degree that's incalculable. And one last example of this is Japanese stiltgrass. So Japanese stiltgrass is very good at taking over forest floors and blocking out any other plant's ability to gain light. Because even though it's called stiltgrass, you can see those broad leaves covering, creating a canopy over the soil, preventing anything from growing near it. That's another trait of a really good invader. So I mentioned biodiversity a moment ago, and I told you it's a fancy word for the number of unique species. And I want to give you an example of what happens when we begin to work to get rid of invaders or monocultural areas of just one species. So first, a little bit on biodiversity. Nature abhors a monoculture. Nature does not do well with just one plant growing. If you look at a farm field, you'll see weeds growing up in between corn and soybeans that our farmers have to fight year after year. If you have just one plant, that means that ecosystem is less resilient. I gave you the example of a forest fire or flood. If you only have one plant or one animal in that area, you only have one solution to any given problem that they face. So that kind of takes away your options. And eventually that system will break down. So what I'm showing you right now, and I apologize for the picture quality, this is a picture of European dune grass infesting some local dunes back around 1990. And the people who were the conservationists in the area wanted to go ahead and try to eradicate this dune grass to restore it back to its original state. So they put in the time and effort and did the work. And what they got was this. This is that same location just a few years later after they did all the removal. And you can see now that we have an ecosystem that has multiple species growing in it. It has a lot of uniqueness and it has a lot more resilience now too. Most likely those dunes have become more stable, erosion is less of a factor, and it's probably not only gotten new plant life, it's probably gotten new animal life as well. So that's a good thing to me. That looks like a great picture. I like that uniqueness. So of course, how do we get here? How do these species get here? Right now, you're looking at a picture of English ivy, and I am tearing this stuff out of my yard and have been for years now because the person who lived in my house before me decided they loved English ivy as an ornamental plant. And while it is very, very pretty, it has spread everywhere. And my poor partner is so tired of pulling it out from in front of our window, she's about to lose her mind. So before I go further, please don't plant English ivy. It can do damage to your home too. But that brings me to the point I'm making. They get here because we bring them here, either intentionally or accidentally. Oftentimes, we will simply go to the store and purchase them, thinking they're going to make a great ornamental for our yard, and we love them because they just keep growing and coming right back. Unfortunately, we often don't see the negative side of this because we're manicuring our yard. We are taking care of it and we are making sure that it looks just the way we want. But there are some downsides to these. And right now I want to make sure you're aware there are some laws that now prevent certain amounts of invaders to be sold. Indiana has a law that is the terrestrial plant law that prevents about 40 some odd invasive species from being sold, but unfortunately it does not cover all of them. For example, winged burning bush. This is a lovely plant. It's a great shrubbery, but the trouble is that when we plant it, we may plant one or two in our yard, but the woods near us suddenly the next year fills with burning bush because we don't notice it. Please, I know a lot of people do love burning bush, but please don't plant it. It spreads so easily and we just never notice it. Winter creeper is another example of something that people have sometimes gotten as an ornamental, and this stuff will spread like wildfire. It will cover everything. It will kill trees. I have an oak nearby that's covered in some that's essentially dying right now. And yes, that's an excellent point Ronald's making in the chat there. Using 2,4-D or a good brush killer is a good solution for English ivy. Watch out for resistance developing though. And we're going to go over some pesticide stuff at the end of this too. Another one, and I know some people don't disagree with this one too, is Callery pear or Bradford pear. So I live in Terre Haute, Indiana, and there is a lot of Callery pear here in Terre Haute. There's one in my neighbor's yard. There is one on practically every street in this town, and unfortunately, they've spread. They are now outside of town, near the highways. If you drive south along 150, south of Terre Haute, you will see them dotting the highway now because they just keep spreading. But people think they make a good ornamental tree because they're so pretty and white. Please don't plant these either. And I'll talk about Callery pear more in our third session. So the goal here that I'm trying to make, the point I'm trying to make is please watch what you purchase. It is not just limited to your yard. Even though you can't see it spread, it is spreading, usually through help from pollinators who are going around just trying to do their business, animals who may use the trees as habitat or just brushing by different plants, And the trouble is that these things may begin to outcompete the things that you want in your yard. They can outcompete your own grass depending on what you plant. So please avoid plants like these and look at some of the laws and some of the communications from people like Purdue Extension or SICM, the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management. So how do we handle invasives? This is the hard part. We need a plan. So let's make a plan. There are a few good tips to follow. This comes from the Adaptive Management of Weeds publication by Randall from 1997. I just took this out of that publication. This is not something I created, so I can't give myself credit for that. But what this is going through is a set of steps. And for those of you who are master gardeners or who are dedicated gardeners even, will probably recognize this as an integrated pest management plan. We're wanting to establish goals for what we're trying to accomplish, identify our species and prioritize the ones that need to be affected, determine what control techniques, and then go ahead and implement the plan. And afterwards, figure out what your results were, and then review and modify as necessary. And this will be up when I put this on YouTube, you'll be able to look at this slide too there. So let's talk a little bit about our target and goals. What you're wanting to accomplish is important because when some of these species spread, folks, you're not going to be able to get all of them. You would have to spend a lifetime trying to eradicate some of these. A lot of our state parks who are combating invasive species have to make hard choices on what they're aiming for and what areas they can do the most good in. So for you, though, that's going to mean you need to figure out what your goal here is. Are you trying to maintain the aesthetic of your yard? Are you working on conservation of an area, or are you just trying to do total eradication in an area? Is there a particular plant or set of plants that you're trying to eliminate or maintain? Like, are you trying to keep a hardwood area healthy for a timber harvest, or just you want that woodlot to remain there because it's something you like? And you need to ask yourself, how can you enhance your local diversity? And this would be a situation where you would work with like someone from SICM or someone from Purdue Extension to give you advice and hook you up with other organizations. So that way you can figure out how best to take care of that area and make it a healthier ecosystem. Identification, this is a really, really hard part in some ways, but it's also an easy one. And it's the most important. Not all invasive species are going to react the same way to the same control methods. Tonight, we're going to talk about Asian bush honeysuckle. This management method works for a lot of our bush invaders, but it won't do the same thing for all of the invaders. Not what you do to bush honeysuckle may not work as well with English ivy or autumn olive or other plants like that. You want to prioritize. Let's say you're trying to make your yard look better. Dandelions aren't a threat, but the honeysuckle at the corner is. That's where you want to be putting your time into, because believe me, a lot of this will be back-breaking labor, excuse me. Make sure you identify all of your pests and invasives and understand the difference between something that's introduced and harmless, so you're not burning your time, versus something that's actually invasive where you can do some good. So our prioritization, there are a couple ways of looking at how you want to prioritize this. And now we're thinking a little bit more about what we can do directly with honeysuckle. So let's say you have these two choices of how to prioritize. You can either do it based on the site that it is located at, where should I go first? Or you could base it on the species. I just want to go after all the honeysuckle first. You may be working with a combination of both, but you need to accept what you're capable of accomplishing versus what you want out of it. So we have a dream that we want to accomplish. We need to accept that that dream may not be possible. So let's do the best we can with it. This could mean working on the biggest bunch of honeysuckle there, the oldest set of them. So that way you can eliminate the more well-established, or it could be focusing on the younger, more tender ones that are going to be easier to remove as versus the older ones. So site-based prioritization is where you're going to map out areas that have been invaded and areas that have been untouched. So your goal is to keep blocks of areas that have been untouched clear of any invaders, and you want to defragment boundaries of invaded areas, basically in the monoculture effect being created by the invader. Whenever you remove something from a site, you also want a reseeding plan to make sure that you could fill in that area. So if you pull a bunch of honeysuckle, Don't just leave it bare because it's going to come right back. Plant something there, plant something that's good, that's going to be competitive and preferably native. So that way you can get that good and established. It'll come up the next year and it'll choke out any honeysuckle that could come up after it. Species-based prioritization is you're looking at what species are growing and where they're moving. So looking at, if you're thinking about particular areas, what's nearby, but not yet approached where the areas you want to protect. Because remember, an invader is able to spread very easily. Eventually they will spread into all areas. What's in your site of interest, figure out what species are present, because unfortunately removal methods may affect other plants too. So you need to figure out what's there so you can account for them to avoid damaging them. Are your current invaders going to expand beyond your boundary that you're establishing for yourself? So if you're trying to eliminate a bunch of, let's say, English ivy, if it isn't moving very far from like the corner of your home, then maybe you could focus on the honeysuckle that is spreading along your fence line. This is how you're going to prioritize this. And then consider using tools to help you assess an area. And this could be something as basic as using some string and some pegs to put in a boundary line to see if things cross it, to using a drone to do a flyover, taking pictures of the area you're interested in to map out using software, which, by the way, our local parks, our state parks do that. I'm one of the drone pilots that helps them do it. All right, so now the plant that I've been beating around the bush with, pun intended there, the Asian bush honeysuckle. So just a quick thing about what this plant is going to look like. So Asian bush honeysuckle, it is going to be the first plant that will green up in the year. That's how you can look around and know we have a lot of it right now, because it was the first thing that greened up and it was practically the only thing that did. They're going to have dark egg-shaped leaves that I believe will be set opposite, if I remember right, though I want to double check that. The big thing that makes them noticeable is that they will have white tubular flowers that are going to appear very, very soon. You'll have an upright bush that can reach anywhere between 6 and 15 feet in height. They will also grow very close together. They're able to form a wall, essentially, of plants in the area that you're interested in. They will become very, very tight packed too. It'll be very thick if infestations are allowed to go out of control. We usually find them in the understories of forest and along edges. So habitats have edges where they connect to a different kind of habitat. Your yard line would be considered the edge of a habitat where you have a fence or something like that. The edge of a forest is that edge habitat where the stuff is going to really do well. They're very good at competing in those areas. I already mentioned they're the first to leaf out, and they will be the last to decline in late September. They also have a tendency to release a chemical in the soil that will inhibit competitors, so they will prevent other plants from growing near them. And they're very good at it too. So let's talk a little bit about our control methods here. Bush honeysuckle really digs into the ground over time, which is why it's so important to pull them when they're younger. But if they are anything but tender shoots, you may need mechanical help to do so. So like I said, pulling by hand does work very well when they're young. They'll come right out. It may take a bit of a tugging, but you'll be able to do it. But once those plants established, they can get really, really embedded in. It can go beyond just simply using a shovel. You might consider the use of a skid steer or a tractor that may help you be able to remove them, especially if the infestation is very, very dense, preventing movement in between the plants. This is something that you're probably going to end up doing before you get to your portions with chemical control. So now we're going to dive into the real meat of it with our chemical controls for this. By the way, I love dandelions. Don't spray them. They're great for pollinators. So let's talk about foliar applications. So you only want to do any foliar application when the plants are within easy reach. If you have a dense infestation, sure, you could spray, but you're not going to reach the plants in the back. This is when you have plants that you have space between that you can reach. You want to spray to wet the foliage. You are not soaking them because that means you're going to have pesticide running off into your soil. And that's just going to defeat your own purpose, because then the things you want to grow will be killed by a pesticide. Timing is going to be late fall or early in spring, though honestly, you can do a foliar application throughout the entire growing season. And I've got some timing information towards the end here. So here are a few pesticides that you might consider to use on honeysuckle. So glyphosate still remains a very effective one with lots of brand names that you can look at, like Roundup, Accord. You're looking for something that has at least 41% glyphosate. 2,4-D with triclopyr, under the brand name Crossbow normally, is effective. And then triclopyr by itself, so you're talking Garlon 3A, that kind of thing. By the way, these tables I can't take credit for. This comes from Purdue publication. And you will see that again if you want to go to the YouTube. I'll make sure that it's still up there. So our cut stump application, this is a method of painting or spraying an herbicide on an exposed stump that you cut close to the ground. You can use either a water or an oil-soluble herbicide, but the timing between the two of them will be different. So what this means is that if you use a water-soluble herbicide on a cut stump application, you have to apply it immediately within minutes of cutting, because that way the plant's vascular system is still operating, the water will absorb, and the plant will distribute it within itself before it dies. Oil-soluble herbicides can be applied after cutting if you need time in between. And then the oil will simply soak into the exposed wood over time, and it'll still get the job done. Though the trouble is that when you're using an oil-soluble herbicide, you do have the concern of runoff, because it does take time to absorb into that plant, and some of it may do runoff. So again, we have many of the same herbicides are going to be effective here with the addition of 2,4-D with Plochlorum. Tordon is probably one of the biggest ones that I hear talked about the most of. Pathway and myself, I'm not familiar with. And of course, we see Roundup, Accord, Garlon 4, and Garlon 4 Ultra. These are ones that I very commonly hear used in these situations. All right, basal spraying. This is spraying an herbicide with an oil-based carrier on the lower 12 to 18 inches of the plant stem. Now, basal spraying can be really effective, but the trouble is it can be challenging because you need to be able to access the plant. So if you have a really, really thick infestation, you're going to have a real hard time getting in close enough to be able to spray them. Or if the plant is particularly bushy and it's got lots of limbs coming out. So you're looking at the potential where you're going to have to trim the plant back no matter what, just to be able to access the points you want to do the application on. This is best done during the dormant season too. And again, you'll see more on the timing here in just a moment. With this, we are now looking at using triclopyr and imazapyr as one of our options, Garlon 4 and Stalker. And we still have triclopyr by itself and 2,4-D plus triclopyr, or Garlon 4, Garlon 4 Ultra, and Crossbow. Again, these are ones that I hear being used fairly commonly. Unfortunately, I can't recommend any of them. I wish I could, but at least you have the information so you can figure that out for yourself. All right, now I've been saying I'm going to talk a little bit about timing. So SICM, the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management, has this excellent publication that is from 2019. I don't know if it's been updated since, it might not need it necessarily, that shows all of the application timings for a lot of our invasives. This is the picture of the first page of that. I cannot take credit for this. This is the hard work of SICM. But what I want to highlight here is this area that's covering a lot of our invasive shrub species, including our Asian bush honeysuckle. But you can also see included in here is multiflora rose, privet, wing burning bush, autumn olive, and Japanese barberry. All of these will have similar control options, like it says there. So I'm going to be going over this again in our multiflora rose session next week. But let's look at the timing a little bit. So if we want to do a foliar spray, you can effectively do a foliar spray and expect to get control between May and September, right up until the point you hit October, basically as long as there are leaves on the plant. Though most publications and most workers in the field I've talked to do agree that it's better to wait towards the fall, because that way you reduce the chance of any interaction with most other plants, because most everything else will have gone dormant at that point. And that way, this plant, the honeysuckle itself, is going to start its dormancy soon. It's kind of in its weaker state. Another one to look at here for our cut surface treatment, you can start right at the end of May into June, and then you can go all the way through the year because you can cut the plant. The only time that you don't want to do this is that those months of April and May. The reason for that is that's when this plant's going to be growing the most. So when you cut it, it's just going to keep on growing, and this plant is really good at growing back. So after those 2 months, when the growth is slowed down, is going to be the best time to go ahead and do that application. And you could see, you could do that straight through the winter too. And then finally here, our basal bark treatment is going to be effective from September through March. So basically you're looking at a winter month spraying. So that way you're not contending with living branches that are green and strong. You're going to be dealing with a plant that is dormant where you can easily cut it back and reach those areas and get that application done. All right, a couple last options I was going to discuss too. So one, prescribed burning is an option for a lot of different invasive species, including bush honeysuckle. This is good for areas that have fire adapted communities, different kinds of woodlots and things like that. It may take a few years to get it done because reseeding is going to be so common, and there will be a pretty hefty seed bank that's going to be developed in a lot of these areas. And keep in mind, in order to do a prescribed burning, you do have to have authorization and training. Now, while that sounds bad, something I want to make sure you're aware of is that Purdue can help you do that. We do have a set of researchers and workers who do prescribed burnings, who will do trainings. So this is a potential option for it. And it is a fascinating thing to learn. It's just does have a certain amount of risk and does require a certain amount of skill to do effectively. And then our last one is goats. So this is one that I haven't seen much scientific information on. It's mainly anecdotal evidence, but our Felden Research Center has shown that goats will eat invasive species pretty readily. So if you have goats, or if you know someone who's looking for areas to graze goats, consider releasing them into areas where you have invasives. They will take them right down to the ground. Just like goats will eat anything, well, apparently that remains true when it comes to invasive species. And I just like a picture of a baby goat, so I'm going to show you guys that. All right, that is what I have for you this evening. I've got my contact information up here. Please contact me anytime, 8 to 4 p.m., Monday through Friday. I'm in both Clay and Owen County, so I have both my phone numbers up there and my email. I also have links to our Purdue Ed store for publications on bush honeysuckle and many other plants and animals, and also a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. If you have plants that are infected with a disease or you just don't know what's wrong with them, you can send them a sample and they will help you figure it out.